Okay, let's dive in. We're talking about someone whose impact, well, it's hard to overstate. Napoleon Bonaparte.
Yeah, our sources really make this claim, quite a bold one, that no political leader in maybe 500 years has shaped Europe quite like him.
It's a massive claim, and that's what we want to unpack today in the deep dive. We'll use the sources you've gathered to really understand why people say that. What's the core of his story?
Exactly. We're looking at his whole empire, how he burst onto the scene, ended up conquering more than half of Europe, which is just incredible when you think about it.
And then the fall. Just as dramatic as the rise, ending with him dying basically alone on this remote island.
It's such a compelling narrative arc. Ambition, massive reforms, almost constant war, and then, well, it unravels.
And the sources really stress his complexity, don't they? We get these simplified views sometimes.
Oh, definitely. Like the focus on his height, which wasn't even that unusual for the time, or boiling him down to just his love life, like maybe you saw in that recent Ridley Scott movie.
Right. But the sources argue that's missing the point. Like anyone operating on that kind of stage, his life was full of contradictions, mistakes, moments of, well, fragility.
And because the scale was so immense, taking power, conquering Italy, Egypt, half of Europe, building a whole new system, these personal complexities weren't just personal, they had huge continent-wide consequences.
That's a great way to put it. For most people, our flaws affect our immediate circle. For Napoleon, leading millions, shaping nations, every decision, every character trait, good or bad, it just got magnified onto the world stage.
And you see that reflected in how much people still talk about him, debate him.
2 centuries later, the sources mentioned, over 220,000 books and articles about him by 1980 alone. That's staggering.
And that number's only exploded since then, obviously. People are still trying to figure him out, the why behind it all.
What drove him? What did he really achieve versus what did he destroy? It's not about painting him as just a hero or a villain, is it?
Not at all. It's about getting into the nuances, understanding this incredibly multifaceted person, and the era he completely dominated.
So that's our plan. We'll trace his journey from becoming emperor of the French, importantly, right through to his death in exile.
We'll dig into the big reforms, the Napoleonic Code, the wars that redrew the map of Europe.
We'll touch on how he's portrayed today, like in films, and even explore a connection maybe fewer people know about his dealings with Iran.
It's a deep dive into a life that genuinely changed the course of history.
Okay, so let's start with that incredible rise. How does this guy, born on Corsica, an island with a pretty contested status at the time, end up emperor? The sources give us a quick background.
Right, so he's born in 1769 on Corsica. And this is key. Corsica had just come under French control the year before he was born, after seeking independence from Genoa.
So he was born French, essentially.
Yeah. Basically, yes, a French subject. He learned French, and crucially, he gets his education, particularly his military training, in mainland France. That foundation in the French military system was absolutely vital.
And the timing. Well, you couldn't make it up, could you? His early career aligns almost perfectly with the French Revolution.
Exactly. The sources really highlight this rapid, almost vertical ascent through the military ranks. The old aristocratic system was collapsing, literally being dismantled during the Reign of Terror.
And that created openings for talented people from outside the old elite, like Napoleon.
Precisely. He wasn't from the high nobility. He sided with the revolutionaries, proved himself incredibly capable, especially in putting down royalist uprisings within France. He showed his value early on.
But it was his military success abroad that really made his name, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Those early campaigns were stunning. He goes into Italy, defeats the Habsburgs, a major European power, taking large chunks of territory. Real tactical brilliance on display.
Then the expedition to Egypt, trying to hit British interests indirectly. And later, defeating Prussia decisively.
These weren't minor skirmishes. They were major victories against established powers, and they made him famous back home.
And this is happening while France itself is still reeling from years of chaos, instability, the directory not really working. They needed a hero.
He became immensely popular, seen as the strong man, the winner, the one who could bring order and glory. And that popularity, well, it translated directly into political ambition.
He wasn't just going to stay a general.
No way. He participates in his own coup d'etat in 1799, the 18th Brumaire coup, overthrowing the Directory.
Takes power, initially as first consul, but that wasn't enough either.
He consolidates, becomes first consul for life, and then the final step. 1804, he's just 35 years old, and he's crowned emperor, The sources kind of poetically say he shed the compliments of the Republic and just became power itself.
And that title he chose, Emperor of the French, not Emperor of France. The sources say this was very deliberate.
It was a huge political statement, not of France like owning the land in the old feudal way, but of the French, implying his power came from the people, the nation.
So still nodding to the revolution's idea of popular sovereignty, even while creating an empire.
Exactly. It was a clever way to bridge that gap, to show that this was a new kind of power rooted in the nation, not just divine right or territory. It reflected the new reality after the monarchy was gone.
And the coronation itself, wow. So much symbolism packed in there. He invites the Pope, which acknowledges tradition.
But then, the crucial moment, he takes the crown himself, doesn't let the Pope place it on his head, crowns himself, and then crowns Josephine.
What do the sources make of that specific act?
They see it as profoundly symbolic. He's saying, my power doesn't come from God via the church or from ancient tradition. I achieved this myself. My legitimacy comes from my actions, my victories, and supposedly the will of the French people.
He also made a point about who he was succeeding, historically speaking. And it wasn't the recent French kings.
No, he deliberately bypassed the Bourbons. He explicitly linked himself to Charlemagne Charles the Great, who had united much of Western Europe 1,000 years earlier.
So he's positioning himself not just as ruler of France, but as a successor to this grand, almost pan-European historical figure.
Precisely. It was a signal of his wider ambitions, implicitly speaking to the German states as well. He saw himself restoring a kind of unified order.
And he even went to Aachen later, didn't he, to visit Charlemagne's actual throne.
He did, just reinforcing that connection, emphasizing this grander vision. He wasn't thinking small. He was challenging the entire existing order of European monarchs.
Okay, so he's emperor, this new kind of emperor. What happens next? This decade of rule from 1804 onwards.
It's a period of just relentless activity, two main tracks, major changes within France, and continuous expansion and conflict across Europe.
Let's start inside France, the reforms. The most famous has to be the Napoleonic Code.
Absolutely. The civil code of the French, formally. And the sources stress this wasn't just tidying up old laws. It was a systematic, logical reorganization based on revolutionary ideas like equality before the law, protection of property rights, secular authority.
And its influence went far beyond France, right?
Hugely so. Because it was clear, structured, and modern, it got adopted or heavily influenced legal systems across Europe, Latin America, parts of the Middle East. Its legacy is genuinely global and lasting.
Beyond the law, what else was he focused on domestically?
Well, science and the arts were important to him for national prestige. And infrastructure, this is a big one. Paris, in particular, was transformed. The sources argue that the Paris we know today, its layout, its basic infrastructure, owes a massive debt to Napoleon's era, much closer to modern Paris than to the city before him.
And what about the economy? France was broke when he took over.
Completely broke. The treasury was empty after years of revolution and war, but he tackled finances head-on, reformed the tax system, made collection more efficient, shifted towards indirect taxes.
And it worked.
Remarkably well. State revenue apparently increased something like 400% in just 6 years. And this is interesting. He managed to do that while actually decreasing the direct tax burden on farmers. That financial stability was crucial for everything else, especially funding the wars.
He also overhauled the administration, the bureaucracy, made it more efficient.
More efficient, yes. More organized, but also much more centralized. Power concentrated in his hands. And this is one of those paradoxes the sources bring up.
Efficiency versus concentration of power.
Exactly. Order was restored, things got done. But it put the fate of the nation very much back into the hands of one man. Some critics, even now, trace the, let's say, notorious slowness of French bureaucracy back to this Napoleonic centralization. What happens, they ask, if the next leader isn't a Napoleon?
And despite the Codex talking about equality, there were major limits on freedoms under his rule.
Oh, definitely. The sources are clear on this. No unions allowed for workers or farmers. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association heavily restricted. Censorship was common. State control was tight.
And the decision on slavery. That seems like a direct contradiction of revolutionary ideals.
It does. The revolution had abolished it. Napoleon brought it back in the colonies. The sources state pretty bluntly this was an economic decision needing cheap labor for colonial plantations. Pragmatism over principle in that case.
How did women fare under his system?
Not well politically. The sources note he wasn't keen on women being involved in public life or politics. The Napoleonic Code gave them very few rights, reinforcing traditional gender roles. No political voice.
Okay, so restrictions, centralization. But were there positive social changes too?
Yes, there were. He established some form of social security system for the poorest, which was quite forward-thinking. Huge investment in roads and canals, not just for the military, but to boost internal trade and transport.
And that helped ordinary people.
It seems so, combined with increased agricultural output, partly due to stability, partly policy living standards improved for many. More reliable food supply, more affordable bread, that kind of thing.
You mentioned infrastructure in Paris. Any specific examples?
Public health was a focus. He initiated major projects to separate sewage from drinking water, a massive step. The first big underground sewer network in Paris, about 30 kilometers long, was built under him. Think about the impact on disease.
And his impact on arts and culture.
Significant. He influenced how museums were run, championing public access, established the Museum of Fine Arts, massively expanded the Louvre, filled it with art, some acquired through conquest, admittedly, and opened it up. Made it a national institution, not just a royal palace.
And monuments.
Commissioned the Arc de Triomphe, the Victory Gate, to commemorate his soldiers and victories. A very visible legacy.
So it's this really mixed picture, isn't it? Order, law, efficiency, infrastructure, public health improvements.
Running alongside tight control, restrictions on freedom, bringing back slavery, centralizing power. The sources suggest his early motives sometimes included genuinely wanting to spread revolutionary ideals, equality, religious freedom, using places like the Kingdom of Westphalia as a model.
Like a showcase for the Napoleonic system.
Sort of. But exporting these ideas inevitably clashed with the old powers, the aristocracy, the church across Europe who didn't want to lose their privileges or accept these changes. So good intentions, maybe, but reality was complex.
And all this domestic activity was happening while he was basically at war constantly, expanding his empire.
Almost constantly. He came to control or heavily influence more than half the continent.
With Britain always being the main opponent, he couldn't quite crack directly.
Right.
Which leads to the continental system.
Right. Since he couldn't defeat the Royal Navy at sea, he tried to defeat Britain economically. The continental system was basically a huge embargo. No territory controlled by Napoleon or his allies was supposed to trade with Britain.
The goal being to strangle their economy.
Exactly. Cut off their markets, weaken their finances, and, as a side effect, hopefully boost French industries by removing British competition.
How well did that work? What were the effects across Europe?
It caused a lot of hardship. Places that relied on British trade, like port cities in Germany or the Baltics, really suffered. Smuggling became a massive industry, people desperately trying to get British goods, or things like coffee, tea, sugar that came via Britain. Prices for those things shot up.
But did it have any positive economic effects as intended?
The sources suggest it did, to some extent. By cutting off imports, it forced European countries to develop their own industries. Local manufacturing, like textiles, got a boost. Agriculture adapted. The German steel industry, for instance, saw some early growth during this period. The material even mentions the Krupp Company tracing origins back to Napoleon, offering prizes for steel production.
So economic warfare is a backdrop to actual warfare, the Napoleonic Wars.
A whole era defined by them, not just one war, but a series, 7 major coalition wars involving almost every European power at some point, always with France on one side.
And the context, as the sources point out, is crucial. European monarchies were terrified of the French Revolution before Napoleon even took full power.
Absolutely. Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, they were actively funding and supporting counter-revolutionaries inside France, trying to restore the monarchy or at least contain the revolution. Napoleon first gained fame fighting against these coalitions.
Which fuels that debate. Was he the aggressor, or was he just defending France against powers that wouldn't leave it alone?
It's a central question the sources grapple with. Some historians paint him as inherently ambitious, loving war. Others argue he was constantly reacting to coalitions formed against him, funded by Britain, determined to crush revolutionary France.
The sources seemed critical of films, like the recent Ridley Scott one, for maybe oversimplifying this and just blaming Napoleon for all the casualties.
Yeah, they suggest it ignores the fact that the other European powers were hardly passive bystanders. They had their own interests, primarily protecting their aristocratic systems and preventing revolutionary ideas from spreading.
Napoleon, this non-royal leader of a revolutionary nation, was a fundamental threat to their entire world order.
You got it. The sources even mention that detail about an English director focusing on Napoleon's supposed lack of manners, almost like his social origins were part of the problem for the old elites. A telling insight into those historical tensions, maybe.
So who are the main players in these wars?
France versus shifting coalitions. Great Britain was the constant, usually funding everyone else. Russia, Prussia, Austria were major land powers, sometimes allied with Napoleon, often against him. Spain, Portugal, Sweden, Holland, various Italian and German states, they were all drawn in at different times.
And Britain's role was often financial muscle.
Huge financial muscle. They could afford to subsidize armies in Austria, Prussia, Russia, allowing these coalitions to keep reforming and fighting even after suffering major defeats against Napoleon.
Among all these conflicts, the sources highlight the war in Spain, the Peninsular War, as particularly important, the beginning of the end.
That's often how it's described. Spain started as an ally, but Napoleon decided to invade and put his own brother on the throne. This sparked massive popular resistance.
And this is where we first hear the term guerrilla warfare.
Exactly. Small, irregular groups using hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, sabotage against the larger French army. It was incredibly effective at tying down huge numbers of experienced French troops in this brutal, unwinnable conflict. It just drained resources and manpower constantly.
Napoleon was also reshaping Germany quite radically during this time.
Massively. He defeated Austria multiple times, effectively dismantled the old Holy Roman Empire in 1806. He defeated Prussia, too.
And created new states, like Westphalia.
Right. Took land from Prussia, created Westphalia as a sort of model Napoleonic kingdom, liberal constitution, Napoleonic Code, religious freedom ruled by his brother Jerome, partly a buffer against Prussia, partly a showcase.
And then the Confederation of the Rhine.
He organized about 40 German states into this confederation in 1806. They were formally allied with France, their foreign and military policy largely controlled by him, their resources available to him. It created a big bloc in Central Europe, a buffer against Russia, and facilitated his economic system.
But the sources mentioned a paradox there. He didn't fully unify them.
No, he kept the individual rulers in place, relying on alliances with them rather than direct rule over a single German state. This perhaps made it harder to manage long-term with all their competing interests. But this whole period is seen as absolutely crucial in the long story of German unification and the conflicts that would later engulf Europe.
Amidst all this war, there's constant diplomacy, too. The Austrian diplomat Metternich keeps popping up.
He's a key figure. The sources describe him negotiating with Napoleon multiple times, even when Napoleon's troops were occupying Vienna. Metternich was playing a long game.
There was one specific negotiation where Metternich offered peace based on a balance of power.
Yes, essentially recognizing Napoleon's gains but trying to establish limits, a stable European system.
But Napoleon refused.
He did. According to the sources, Napoleon still saw himself on the rise, unstoppable. Metternich, perhaps more shrewdly, sensed Napoleon had reached his peak and was trying to lock in a settlement. Napoleon, meanwhile, saw the coalitions as the aggressors and wasn't willing to give up anything he'd won.
And around this time, amidst all the political and military maneuvering, comes a huge personal decision with political ramifications: divorcing Josephine.
It's a pivotal moment. The sources are quite clear. The main driver was the lack of an heir. Napoleon felt he needed a legitimate successor to secure his dynasty and the empire's future.
Even though they seem to have a strong personal connection.
Apparently so, but the political need for an heir and perhaps the opportunity for a strategic political marriage outweighed personal feelings. He needed to solidify his rule through lineage.
So he starts looking for a new wife, a strategic marriage. He asks the Russian Tsar first.
Proposed to Tsar Alexander I's sister, yes, but was rejected.
So then he turns to Austria, his recent enemy.
Incredible, isn't it? He proposes to Marie-Louise, the daughter of the Austrian Emperor Francis I, and Metternich, again, plays a key role in making this happen.
How did Metternich convince the Austrian emperor? Austria had been repeatedly humiliated by Napoleon, and Marie-Louise was the great niece of Marie Antoinette, executed during the Revolution.
Metternich apparently argued it was a strategic necessity for Austria's survival. His angle, according to the sources, was, if we don't ally with Napoleon through marriage, he might ally more strongly with Russia, and Russia is actually the bigger long-term threat to Austria. Better to join Napoleon now.
A calculated gamble.
A very calculated gamble. And it worked. The marriage happened. This upstart emperor married into one of the oldest, most prestigious royal families in Europe.
And Marie-Louise. She reportedly grew up hating Napoleon.
She did. But the sources suggest that marrying the quote-unquote most powerful man in the world might have changed her perspective somewhat.
And crucially, this marriage produced the heir he wanted.
Yes. A year later, in 1811, their son, Napoleon II, was born. The succession seems secure. But the timing is interesting. The sources place this birthright between the Fifth and Sixth Coalition Wars, just as Napoleon was arguably passing his absolute peak. The decline was about to begin.
And the event that really triggered that decline, often called his greatest mistake, the invasion of Russia in 1812.
The fatal mistake, many call it. The immediate cause, the sources note, was Russia pulling out of the continental system and resuming trade with Britain, defying Napoleon.
So Napoleon decides to force them back into line with this massive invasion, the Grande Armée.
One of the largest armies ever assembled in Europe up to that point. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, not just French, but Germans, Poles, Italians, Swiss, Dutch, Spanish. A truly multinational force, reflecting his empire's reach.
They march into Russia. Initial successes.
Yes, they'd advanced quickly, won battles like the bloody Battle of Borodino, and reached Moscow relatively fast.
But the Russians had a plan. The scorched earth strategy.
Brutally effective. As the Russian army retreated, they destroyed everything in their path. Food, shelter, supplies, leaving nothing for the advancing Grande Armée to live off.
So when Napoleon gets to Moscow,
he finds it largely deserted, and soon after he arrives, fires break out, destroying much of what remained. There's no delegation waiting to surrender, no decisive victory, just an empty, burning city.
And then the Russian winter arrives.
The killer blow. The army was unprepared for the extreme cold. Supply lines were stretched impossibly thin, logistics broke down completely. Disease, especially typhus, swept through the ranks. Starvation set in. Soldiers were reduced to eating their horses. The sources describe the retreat as horrific, harassed by Russian troops, frozen, starving, diseased. The Grande Armée disintegrated. Figures vary, but the sources mention losses around 300,000, with disease claiming maybe a quarter of those.
His first undeniable catastrophic defeat. He apparently blamed nature.
He reportedly said he was defeated by General Winter, by nature, not by men. But the sources clarify it was a combination, the brilliant Russian strategy and the brutal environment. And the impact of this disaster was immediate, wasn't it? It weakened him militarily.
And politically. It shattered the image of invincibility. His enemies saw their chance.
Straight away, the Sixth Coalition forms. Russia, Prussia, eventually Austria again, Britain funding it all, plus the forces fighting him in Spain. The sources call it the most powerful coalition he'd faced yet.
And sentiment was shifting among his own troops, too, especially the Germans.
Definitely. The suffering in Russia fueled anti-Napoleonic feeling and German nationalism. Soldiers from Allied states became less willing to fight for him. This weakened his armies just as the coalition was growing stronger.
Metternich manages to get Austria to switch sides again, despite Napoleon being married to the emperor's daughter.
Incredible diplomacy, or perhaps just ruthless pragmatism. Metternich convinced Emperor Francis it was time for Austria to lead the effort to defeat Napoleon and reshape Europe, reclaiming Austria's influence.
And Metternich framed this coalition as fighting for legitimacy, for peace.
Yes, for a lasting peace, a new balance of power. They even offered Napoleon a peace conference, trying to appear reasonable, but he refused, still hoping perhaps to turn the tide militarily.
But the tide had turned. He suffers major defeats in 1813, 1814.
The Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, was a huge loss. The coalition armies then pushed into France itself.
And they take Paris?
March 1814, Paris falls. His own marshals basically tell him it's over, he needs to abdicate.
Which he does. And the terms are exile to Elba.
April 1814, he abdicates. He's given the island of Elba, off the coast of Italy, near Corsica. He gets to keep the title of Emperor, sovereignty over the island, and a guard of 600 soldiers.
Which seems remarkably lenient, considering.
It does. The sources speculate why. Maybe respect for his past achievements, maybe fear of making him a martyr if they executed him, maybe because he wasn't a traditional monarch, so killing him felt different. Whatever the reason, it wasn't prison or death.
And back in France, the Bourbons are restored. Louis VIII takes the throne. The victors head to Vienna to redraw the map.
The Congress of Vienna begins, aiming to create that new European order Metternich had envisioned. And the sources remind us of that anecdote Napoleon telling Louis VIII years before to enjoy his retirement. Well, now Louis was back.
But Elba wasn't the final chapter. He was only there for, 10 months?
Less than a year.
Yeah.
His charisma, his legend, especially among the common soldiers, was still incredibly powerful.
The sources emphasize this charisma wasn't just smoke and mirrors, right? It was built on real victories, shared hardship.
Exactly. He wasn't just a politician giving speeches. He was a military genius who had led them to conquer Europe, who they'd seen risk his life alongside them. They believed in him. He knew how to use propaganda, control the narrative through newspapers, sure, but the core appeal was real.
So, February 1815, he escapes Elba, lands in the south of France, and marches on Paris.
It's an amazing story. Troops sent to stop him just defected. The famous scene where he confronts them, opens his coat, tells them to shoot their emperor if they dare, and they shout, "Vive l'empereur!" and join him.
Just shows the power he still held over the army.
Unbelievable loyalty. He reaches Paris without a fight. Louis VIII flees again. This begins the 100 Days.
What did he do during this brief return? Try to consolidate, reform?
Yeah, tried some quick economic and legal fixes, apparently sent peace feelers to Britain, which were immediately rejected. Everyone knew his return meant war. The European powers didn't hesitate. The Seventh Coalition formed instantly. They knew they had to deal with him decisively this time.
Which leads to Waterloo, June 1815.
The final decisive battle, a relatively short campaign ending with Napoleon's defeat by the combined British, Prussian, and Allied forces under Wellington and Blücher.
And this time, the exile was much further away.
Much, much further. St. Helena, a tiny, remote British island in the middle of the South Atlantic. The sources stress its isolation 2,000 kilometers from anywhere. Escape was impossible.
He lives there for 6 years.
Dies there in 1821. For years, there were rumors of arsenic poisoning, maybe by his British captors, but the sources mention modern medical analysis from 2008 points pretty conclusively to stomach cancer. And his end there, the sources note, was quite poignant. Alone, without his wife, his son, his lovers. A reflection of how completely his power had evaporated, isolated in death as he was geographically.
It's an incredible life story. Before we talk legacy, let's quickly cover that Iran connection the sources mentioned. Seems a bit unexpected.
It really highlights the global chessboard Napoleon was playing on. So Iran at the time is ruled by the Qajars, Fath Ali Shah. Its key strategic importance. It borders British India.
And India was crucial to Britain's wealth and power.
Absolutely. So Napoleon, always looking for ways to hurt Britain indirectly, sees Iran as a potential partner. Iran, for its part, is worried about both Russian expansion from the north and British influence. A shared enemy, potentially?
So they start talking.
They were
Diplomatic exchanges.
Yes. Letters exchanged. This leads to the Finkenstein Treaty in 1807, signed in Paris. Interestingly, the sources point out the Iranian negotiator represented Abbas Mirza, Fath Shah's son and viceroy, known for his interest in modernization and diplomacy.
What did the treaty promise?
France promised military aid. Help Iran get Georgia back from Russia, provide advisors, cannons, engineers to modernize the Persian army. In return, Iran agreed to things aimed directly at Britain. Expel all British citizens, help stir up trouble for the British in India, specifically using Afghans, and grant French troops passage and port access if Napoleon decided to march towards India.
Did France follow through?
Initially, yes, to some extent. Napoleon sent a military mission under General Gardane. Some aid arrived. But then European politics shifted dramatically, as it always did.
Napoleon makes peace with Russia.
Exactly. Shortly after the Finkenstein Treaty with Iran, Napoleon signs the Treaty of Tilsit with Tsar Alexander the Rust. France and Russia become allies. This completely changes the game for Iran.
Because now Russia isn't France's enemy anymore.
Right. So Russia now has a free hand to deal with Iran without worrying about France. They resume their war and eventually annex the Caucasus territories Iran had hoped France would help them recover.
A tough position for Iran, caught between these giants.
Incredibly difficult. The sources describe Iranian politicians at the time as maybe inexperienced in navigating this complex, great game, lacking the tools, trying to figure out how to play Russia off against Britain or France off against both. Napoleon seemed like a good bet initially because he didn't seem to want Iranian territory himself, unlike the other two.
And the sources highlight a specific moment from General Gardane's mission, a question from Abbas Mirza.
Yes, a really significant moment. Abbas Mirza apparently asked Gardane, "What do you, the French, have that we don't? What did you do that we didn't? Tell us so we can learn." It's seen as a key moment sparking Iran's own push towards modernization and trying to understand European power.
After the French alliance collapsed, Iran tried aligning with Britain.
They did, trying to get British help against Russia, but that didn't really work out either in stopping Russian advances long term. The sources call it a bitter period for Iran, constantly being played by these European powers whose alliances shifted so fast. Imagine trying to keep up when Austria is switching sides mid-war. It just shows how Napoleon's actions rippled outwards, forcing even distant countries into these complex, often disadvantageous diplomatic maneuvers.
Okay, so let's pull back and look at the broader legacy. We know countless books are written about him. What are the lasting impacts?
Well, the tangible things are huge. The civil code, as we said, foundational for law in many places. The French education system, the administrative structure, much of it still bears his stamp. Paris's urban landscape, even museum management.
And the intangible stuff, too, like his image.
His pose, the hand and waistcoat thing, his style. Even, oddly, that pastry named after him, though the sources say it likely came from a Neapolitan cake originally. Historians certainly see him as pivotal. Will Durant called the whole period the Age of Napoleon. Churchill compared his practical impact to Julius Caesar's.
And Marx used his coup as a case study.
Right. Marx saw Napoleon III's later coup as mirroring the original Napoleon's 18th Brumaire. He used it to illustrate his theory about how a strongman figure can rise when social classes are deadlocked, promising stability and order even at the cost of political freedom, provided they manage daily life effectively. Which brings us back to that core tension the sources emphasize. Judging him is incredibly difficult because the legacy is so contradictory.
You have the positive view. Stabilizer of the economy, creator of the law code, exporter of revolutionary ideals like equality and religious freedom, even if inconsistently applied, builder of infrastructure, improver of public health and administration. His quote sums it up. I am the French Revolution.
Then the negative view. The re-centralization of power, undoing revolutionary decentralization, the brutal suppression of freedom speech, press, association, bringing back slavery, limiting women's rights, the immense human cost of his wars.
The sources basically say your judgment depends entirely on what you value more, which aspects you weigh heavier, and that historical perspectives themselves change over time. Understanding the events is the first step.
And popular culture keeps helping us engage with those events, especially movies.
So many movies. It's amazing how he continues to inspire filmmakers, even if they play fast and loose with the facts sometimes.
The sources mentioned the recent Ridley Scott film, found aspects visually helpful, but historically questionable in places like Austerlitz on ice, or the timing of Josephine's death.
But they still felt it was worthwhile watching, despite the inaccuracies. Maybe the spectacle justifies it for filmmakers.
Perhaps. They felt it wasn't a very good movie compared to others on the subject, but it did visualize things. In contrast, they praised the much older film Waterloo from the 70s.
Why do they prefer that one?
Found it brought them closer to the history, appreciated the scale using real locations and thousands of extras, felt more authentic in depicting the battle itself.
And there are Russian films about 1812, too.
Yes, available online apparently, shows how different nations remember and interpret these shared historical events involving Napoleon. That constant reinterpretation, that enduring fascination, it just underlines his massive enduring impact.
So we've covered an enormous amount of ground. Napoleon's journey from Corsica to emperor to exile, the reforms, the wars, the empire building, the fall.
A figure of just immense contradictions, order and repression, revolutionary ideals and imperial ambition, connecting Europe through conflict and law, even reaching out to places like Iran.
And as the sources repeatedly stress, judging him isn't simple. Depends on your perspective, what you prioritize, the laws, the stability, the glory, or the loss of freedom, the return to slavery, the cost in lives.
His story really throws into sharp relief how dynamic history can be, how quickly power can shift, how fragile political structures sometimes are.
Right. And thinking about that, seeing how radically Europe's map and alliances changed in just a couple of decades under Napoleon, how powers rose and fell so quickly. What does that make you think about political stability and change today? Are things really more stable now, or do the same underlying forces of ambition, ideology, and power politics still operate, just maybe in different ways?
I think that's a fascinating question. What lessons about leadership, about the tension between reform and control, about the sheer consequence of ambition? What can we still draw from Napoleon's story, a story that clearly still resonates so powerfully 2 centuries on, leaves you with a lot to think about?